Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. I'm just ready for this to be over with and done with all this recording. I'm going to start at the 2/9/2016 final modification hearing and the final enforcement hearings. I was forced to proceed without counsel as requested and due me my Sixth Amendment constitutional right to counsel, and also no continuance that I requested. Ultimately, what happened was, again, we had Brooke Folks refusing to work on my case, subpoena my witnesses, get evidence into the record, and even tell me what was going to happen on the day of trial, with her refusing to do that when I appeared in court, not knowing what to expect, whether or not she's going to represent me or not, because she'd given me different representations as to whether or not when I signed the motion to withdraw that was terminating her. She gave me so many different representations, I didn't know what I was coming to do on that date. And so I didn't even bring much evidence, because if they were going to incarcerate me, I didn't want them to confiscate my evidence. And ultimately, I've already filed and made a great case for the record. And so I knew ultimately me coming and bringing all this stuff and going through all that rigmarole doesn't mean they're actually going to hear it anyways. So not knowing what I was going to be able to go and do, knowing that ultimately they should have afforded me a new attorney and a continuance, not necessarily believing it should move forward. And then also knowing that we never had our discovery control plan. Ken Harder in these proceedings for the enforcement hearing pled for a Schedule 3 discovery control plan. One was never proposed, one was never signed, one was never entered. So again, we got a due process violation on the final orders that were signed or actually made as a rulings of the court on 2/9. We did not meet the proper prerequisites to have a final hearing. So again, they violate due process. So we have another void order. But ultimately I showed up, and again I said, at this point, Your Honor, can I talk to my counsel and see what she had prepared? And that's when I found out her only defense for me, after all of the facts, all of the 2 months and plenty of time, agreed all legal defenses, that her defense was going to be based on the street name of Norma Taylor's address, which is Rustown in Dallas, Rustown, and the fact that when Ken Harder put it in the October motion, it said Rustown as 2 words. Now, what she's going for is it's not clear enough to be enforced by contempt, and to a certain extent, she's correct. These enforcement orders have to be crystal clear, no ambiguity. They should be able to stand alone in what the person that's being charged is being ordered to do. And so her claim was, with all of the valid defenses she could have used, to dismiss it, to fight it, to challenge it, I'm going to defend that you could not have possibly be held in contempt, because how could you drop her off at Rustown when it's Rustown in Dallas? There is no Rustown. Like, she had the property CAD records and everything, and that was her defense. After convincing me she could not dismiss it because it's a suit that's not ripe in the matter of the marriage of, now she's ready to get down to the name of the street, which I felt was a pretty weak defense, because they may not have spelled it correctly, and she would have argued I don't know where to take her. But again, remember, I actually complied, and I took her 3 times. I had her subpoena, gave the information to Brooke Folks, so obviously I knew the address. So she was setting me up to look like a complete fool. If that would have worked, that also means that the order not being clear enough to be enforced by contempt, it would have worked when we challenged all of the other aspects of, again, it being in the matter of the marriage of. But that was her plea. She had a picture of me and my children on Facebook, so she was going to advocate that I'm a mom and, don't put this mom in jail. And I don't even remember what the other thing. I think at some point she was going to argue the motion to dismiss enforcement, but the problem is what was filed was a motion to set aside, that means vacate, void, the temporary order that by law should have never been entered in the first place. It was the same motion to set aside temporary orders, and in turn dismiss the enforcement. Because if the temporary order goes away, then there is no enforcement, right? And so that had actually received, where was the enforcement again? Okay, here. So right, if this goes away, then this can't exist, because there was nothing for me to violate. The court had actually sent a notice of hearing on this, but then Judge Miskell decided she's above the law, and she is not going to hear my right to vacate this order that should have never been signed, that was also signed by fraud. She pretty much told her as an attorney, you're not going to discuss that, but you can do the motion to dismiss enforcement. And so again, the things that she brought up in her statement after talking to her for 5 minutes and realizing that's the only thing she had planned, and again, still did not have anything to legitimately defend me when I was in an accident in an ambulance in the hospital. I just said, you know what, you're right. You want out of this case. She's smiling on the day of trial, like this is all exciting and we're gathering for a party, for crying out loud. I absolutely did say, I agree, you're not going to represent me today. But then I did ask for counsel. Emily Miskell, again, deciding to write the law, denied me right to counsel or continuance, so I'd have enough time. This was the first official final hearing, and so again, based on the rules, I should have been granted the continuance and time to prepare, but I wasn't. So they moved forward, and Emily Miskell entered a void unlawful order to modify the parent-child relationship, possession, and access. She entered that as a rulings of the court, 470-52517-2014, just as a memorandum. You'll be able to see that in the book and all the documents that are released. And then she also enters a void unlawful suspension of commitment for jail for 14 days on legally void order for contempt of possession and access. So because the visits were Friday to Saturday, Saturday to Sunday, for 7 counts, that again, even if she was released, let's say we go along with the fraud that's stated in the records, which is I asked to represent myself. Again, I did not. Asking for new counsel and to not have this fruitcake represent me is totally different than me saying I don't want her to represent me with this foolishness, but I want new counsel. That is totally different from, no, Your Honor, I have a right to effective counsel and I want a new attorney, as I had been asking since December 28th, and her proceeding and saying that I requested to represent myself. Again, Truth Judge Jesus was watching. Emily, you can lie all day long. It's not going to work. So anyways, they entered this void unlawful suspension of commitment. So for 7 counts, 2 days each, 14 days for the legally void order, contempt of possession of access. That's what they gave me. So then we move to now, from 2/9 to 2/24, Emily Miskell court ordering the high risk, neglect, abuse, harm, and illegal 2-week quote-unquote makeup visits and kidnapping of my daughter. I want to say thank you to Kay and Sandy just for being with me there and just keeping me strong and talking with me as I waited for Pastor and Isaiah to go and get her and bring her back to the courthouse. And then just even having my Jesus encounter in the hallway for the pastor that showed up and saw my tears as I was just simply singing, Lord, I remember, yeah, when I called your name, you came to my rescue, even though I was to blame. So I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name, Jesus. So I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name. You looked at me when no one else did. Impossible, but you did it again. You looked past my faults. You saw that I needed you. So I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name, Jesus. So I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. There's just something about that name. Master, Savior, Jesus. Let all heaven and earth proclaim. I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name, Jesus. So I whispered your name, Jesus. I called your name. Thank you, Jesus.
What? No.
So many people, I know that was probably weird, but I just have to stop and give him props where props are due. God is going to get full total, complete glory. I said thank you, Kay. Thank you, Sandy, for being there with me as Emily Miskell ordered that I be confined to the courthouse. They go get Mariah and bring her back. And in exchange for my body, they take hers. I, at that time, I wasn't as bold. I wasn't as courageous to not say to the judge, yes, before my witnesses, no, Your Honor, I'm not. This is a void order. I'm not allowing you to kidnap her right in front of my face. And I went along with it because I posted on Facebook, for those of you that remember that day, that I probably was going to be incarcerated because I ultimately knew they were not listening to facts. I'd prepared everybody for that. We were all prepared for that possibility. And when they said, can anyone get the child, I thought for sure that was it. I didn't know she was going to order complete separation for my baby girl from anybody and everybody she's always known her entire life of 23 months into, again, this very risky, neglectful, abusive environment. But ultimately she did. And Kay and Sandy, you spent time there with me, just talking with me and just helping to keep me together. And then again, I just had to go into a state of praise. And so for the pastor, I believe you said you were from Oak Cliff or Lancaster, definitely from the south side, that saw me pacing and just walking and crying out and having my time right there in the Collin County Courthouse with my father. I say, when I was to blame, a lot of domestic violence victims, they'll tell you in the domestic violence shelters not to get into any self-blame at all for their abuse and for the situations we find ourselves in. And ultimately, it's not so much blaming myself as it is accepting my role and my responsibility. And what does that mean? Meaning, if I had not ever fallen for I just got saved, I'm turning my life around, I'm so sorry, for threats I made before, and just all of the showing stuff that Curry Johnson was going through when we started, seeing each other and dating in May, had I not given in to all of that. And then ultimately, a lot of people disagree with this because a lot of people feel like, ultimately God's a forgiving God, so we can engage in sexual sin. But the bottom line is I have to accept responsibility. Had I not been willing to engage in that, I wouldn't have even been here in the first place. At the same time, God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love Him, are called according to His purposes. If I hadn't engaged in that, I also wouldn't have Mariah. So ultimately, I know that God has forgiven me. But it is in moments like that when I realize, oh my gosh, how am I in such a bad situation with such a vindictive, abusive, angry, just guaranteed and just hell-bent on seeing our daughter's property, father and paternal family. I did choose that. And so I have to take my part, my role in that choice. But crying out to God and saying, okay, I really am in a bad situation, but I'm calling on you, and I know that you will meet me right here in this courthouse. Another thing that was interesting that happened, and I don't know if it's just way too weird, like she's not cursing at us, she's not screaming at us, she's being respectful, but they had about 6 or 7 law enforcement officers on detail. Literally, I looked above my head on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Officers were standing there. They had a guy that was standing there to the left of me, right there at the courthouse doors. They had officers in the front. Everywhere I turned, I was surrounded by law enforcement, as if I was a violent person, I was going to run or do anything. But ultimately, I believe that's just God's way of also showing how much they consider you a threat or high profile. I mean, all that was necessary. But all I do know is after Truth Judge Jesus and I had our singing, crying it out session, and it was sinking in what was about to happen, again, I thank you for the pastor that approached me and said, can I pray with you? And held hands with me, and we prayed right there over the big seal on the floor in the Collin County lobby, waiting for my daughter to be dropped back off. Again, it's times like that is the strength, just like with Raymond Schwab, being imprisoned and naked and on dirty floors in a dirty cell in isolation as they tried to break him. But again, he went to that place, which is why that article in his story meant so much to me. He went to that place. I know what that's like. I've been there before, where all you've got is I've got to I've got to cry out, Jesus, do something. Strengthen me, help me. And so ultimately, I just had to stop and take some time to give God the due time and credit that He deserves in this whole thing, because ultimately, without Truth Judge Jesus, I wouldn't even be standing here today. You all know how the situation would have turned out. But again, 3 years later, no arrest, no loss of children, because Truth Judge Jesus, again, I'm not alone, even though I may be pro se. He's obviously, I won't say he's fighting on my side. I'm on his side, which is the voice of truth. And as long as I'm on his side, you should know the truth, and the truth set you free. Then we know how the story ends. Sometimes you got to lose the battles to win the war. Looks like my battery's dying.